So I've been asked this evening to talk about this book, Broken Signposts. My publishers gave it the subtitle, How Christianity Makes Sense of the World, which was kind of an interesting thing. Like often happens with newspaper headlines, the author didn't actually choose that subtitle, but I kind of like it because you might imagine it would be How Christianity Makes Sense in the World. But this book does go one step further than that, and try to address the question of how Christianity makes sense of this world, because the world is a puzzling place. And the more we get to know the world with modern science and technology and goodness knows what, space technology and surveillance and so on, the more puzzling it becomes. We know some things, but that merely reveals to us the extent of our continuing ignorance. And if anyone thinks that that's not so, and that actually modern science has got it all sussed and we just have to fill in a few footnotes and that will be all right, well, I suspect none of you think that, but then that would raise all sorts of other questions. But the backstory of this book, some of you will be aware of, that I wrote a book called Simply Christian 15 years ago. And that took me some while to get into, because the challenge that the publishers had set me was to do a sort of 21st century equivalent of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which has been, of course, a famous book, doing all kinds of things and helping people in a skeptical age to see why actually the option of Christian faith might be a good thing. Lewis began that book by the puzzle of justice, and I decided I would begin Simply Christian with the puzzle of justice, and I begin this book with that as well. But in Simply Christian, I have 4 opening chapters, which I called Echoes of a Voice. And what I mean by that is this: if I walk out on the street outside my house here, I now live in central Oxford, rather to my surprise, and if I hear somebody calling my name, I look up and down the street to see who it is. But if I can't see anybody, wait a minute, was somebody really calling me? Should I go and investigate? What's going on here? And it's that sort of puzzlement that we have when we hear or think about or are aware of the 4 subjects I then identified as justice, spirituality, relationships, and beauty. That is to say, when we think about fairness and justice and getting things straight and putting things right, we all know in our bones, as we say, that that matters. And when we think about spirituality, after the decades of kind of barren secularism where people said, oh, there's no such thing as spirituality, that's just fairyland, that's just fantasy. Actually, most people throughout the world, throughout history, and most people in our own day know that there is more to human life than simply what you can put, as I've often said, into a test tube or into a bank balance. In other words, there is something going on which we feel like the echo of a voice calling us, and it's tempting, because of the busyness and the aridity of much modern life, to dismiss that and just say, oh no, that's just wishful thinking. Just get on and do your job and pay your bills, and that's quite enough. But most of us know there's something more than that. And then there are relationships, and I use that word relationships rather than love, because love is such a slippery word. I'll come back to that. But with relationships, virtually all human beings know that relationships with other people particularly, but also with the environment around us or with animals, whatever, that relationships matter, and the ones closest to us matter enormously. They make us who we are, and yet we know that they all fail in one way or another. And then the 4th one that I had was beauty, where beauty is clearly really important. And all human societies, from early cave paintings right through to postmodern music, have said that there's something about beauty which leads us beyond ourselves. But beauty again lets us down. The sunset fades into darkness, and so on. So in Simply Christian, I ran those 4 as a kind of a thought experiment to set up a question. And for me, this was a sort of apologetics, but it wasn't like the normal, rather rationalist apologetics, where you start with fixed points about the world, fixed evidences and simply build up from there and end up saying, therefore God exists, or therefore Christianity is true, or whatever. I wanted to come at it in a rather different way. And this present book, Broken Signposts, does the same thing, builds off another one, which I'll come back to in just in a moment. I keep on promising what I'm going to do in a moment. I have to remember, check my notes to make sure I've got that right. So what I then did in Simply Christian, and I'm explaining this so that you see the progress of my thought, how I got to the strange position I've landed up now, was to say we need to keep those questions somewhere where we can see them and they can see us, and they go on teasing us. And then let's just take a deep breath and tell the story which the Bible tells. Now, there are many other stories you could tell. You could go to other so-called religious traditions or philosophical traditions, and yeah, that'd be fun too, and see how they get on with talking about justice and spirituality and relationships and beauty. That would be interesting, but what I wanted to do was to say, here is the Christian story, the story which begins with this strange account of creation, and then the call of a people who are called Abraham's family or Israel, and then out beyond that, what happens to these people, and how that all seems to be itself a bit of a broken signpost, because the people of God go into exile, and even though they come back, it's all a bit strange and doesn't seem quite to have worked. And then the story of Jesus bursts out in the New Testament and says, actually, this is what it all means. And gradually we realize that those echoes of the voice which we heard before were echoes of this story, or can be seen as such. And then they mean that the people who find themselves called to follow Jesus are called to be people who themselves speak that voice or call that name down the street so that other people can hear it. So that was what I did in Simply Christian. Then when I was doing my Gifford lectures 2.5 years ago, History and Eschatology, sharing a title with Rudolf Bultmann, who was the last New Testament scholar before me to do the Gifford lectures, which I find considerably amusing, since a lot of this book is critique of Bultmann. I decided that at one point in this book, which is an argument about natural theology and about the place of Jesus in natural theology, which is not how that's normally been done, but I wanted to run a similar argument to what I'd run in Simply Christian, which is not, as I say, a traditional natural theology or a traditional apologetic, but it was a way of going beyond what I did in Simply Christian to say, when we are faced with questions like this bubbling up within human society, then it's a question whether human society is just all a fiction, whether we're just a mass of floating signifiers, as in postmodernity, or whether life is just a sick joke, as in Jean-Paul Sartre, or whatever. Were these really echoes of a voice, or were they only imaginative echoes from latent atavistic impulses within our own consciousness, etc.? And so in chapter 7 of History and Eschatology, I run those 4 that I had before, but I add 3 more. So we've got justice, spirituality, relationships, beauty, and then I added freedom, truth, and power. And in each case, rather briefly, in History and Eschatology, I showed that all 7 of them have the same sort of shape. That is, we all know they're important, but we all mess them up. And that's the problem. But then, in History and Eschatology, I argue that the story of the death of Jesus is the story which makes sense, because there we see justice denied, beauty trampled upon, freedom squashed, power abused, and so on with all 7. And that actually the cross is a way of God saying, not that these were signposts which would point happily up to some heavenly truth, but that actually here is a story which tells how God has come down to the places where the broken signposts have let us down, because that's where we all are, with justice denied, freedom trampled on, power abused, truth turning into fake news, etc. The cross is the story of how God has come down to meet us there. So my argument there, which is what then Broken Signposts picks up from, is that these signposts, these interesting signals, which all human beings pretty much are aware of, the fact that they let us down in the way they do mean that we can't straightforwardly argue an apologetic from them up to God, but that when we see the gospel story of the death of Jesus and then of his resurrection, we look back and we say, they were true signposts. In other words, these were the right questions to be asking, even though by themselves they weren't able to give you the right answer. Rather like a Christian reading of the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures would be to look back at that whole narrative from Genesis to Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible, or Genesis to Malachi in our English Bibles, and to say, well, as it stood, that whole story is somewhat puzzling. I mean, it's noticeable that in the great Jewish tradition, they can't just leave it at that. You have to have the rabbis to interpret and say, now we are moving forward in this way. But the Christian story from the beginning looks at that story and says, those were the right questions to be asking. What does it mean to be the family of Abraham? What does it mean to be the people of the Creator God? Here is the story which gives you the answers. So finally, I'm coming to it. In Broken Signposts itself, what I decided to do here was a different sort of thought experiment. I worried whether it was actually going to work or not, but I wrote it and I sent it to my publishers, and bless him, my publisher, Mickey Morden at HarperCollins, he said, actually, this does work and let's do it. And that's been exciting because I thought, well, it's one thing to set up these 7 signposts and to show this business about how they don't work, etc., but then maybe how the gospel does. But maybe what we need to do is to dig into a well-known scriptural text and show how that actually makes sense of them all. And because I haven't written very much about the Gospel of John in the past, I've done a bit, I've tended to concentrate on the Synoptic Gospels and on Paul in particular, as most of you probably know. I thought, let's take John, because I love John. You know, I was once asked in a job interview a long time ago, well, you've written about the Gospels, you've written about Paul, what about John? And I rashly said, and I think she has forgiven me for this, that I feel about John like I feel about my wife. I love her very much, but I don't claim to understand her. And of course, that got me a laugh in the interview, but actually it didn't get me the job. And maybe there was a lesson there too. But so with John, what I decided to do was to say, okay, take justice. Here is the problem of justice. We all know it matters, but it fails. We all get it wrong. What does John say about justice? Here is love, and I call it love in this book rather than relationships. Let's talk about love. And then what does John say about love? Well, God so loved the world, of course, but there's a lot more than that as well. And then spirituality, and then the others until freedom, truth, and power. Because one of the things that's fascinated me about John for a long time is the way in which when Jesus confronts Pontius Pilate in chapters 18 and 19 of John's Gospel, which is almost a kind of a charter for a Christian political theology, what they are arguing about is kingdom and truth and power. So truth and power, and the question of what God's kingdom has to do with them, or Caesar's kingdom for that matter, this actually is woven into it. So what I did in this book was to take each of those 7 topics, and having set out the problem, then to run a reading of John's Gospel in relation to that theme, and also, of course, as an introduction to John, because though many Christians, and certainly I'm sure all you pastors, know John's Gospel pretty well, I suspect that by running these themes through John, there might be some fresh insights and new ways into old texts. And we'll get back to that in the second half. So that's how the book works. And I interposed between the chapters little interludes, 2 or 3 or 4 pages on how to read John. And again, I'll say more about that in the second half now. But in the time that remains to me now, before we go into our first Q&A, let me just say a little bit more about the different 7 topics. And I start with justice. And again, I'm telling tales out of school, but my wife won't mind me telling this one, that I was very struck by the fact We were having dinner with some old friends, and the husband was, like me, a New Testament scholar, and we'd been looking forward to having a good natter about different aspects of New Testament scholarship, etc. But the seating plan put him next, not to me, but to my wife. And bless him, he's a good conversationalist, and he asked my wife what she'd been reading. And as you might suspect from a pastor's wife, a bishop's wife, she mostly reads murder mysteries. And I hope that just occasions a little ripple of laughter among those of you who are listening. Something about being married to a pastor, being married to a bishop, makes, and Maggie isn't the only one by any means in this bracket, as I know from many conversations, and it makes them long to have a story where everything's gone wrong, but in a murder mystery, eventually it all gets sorted out. That's what you long for. And my friend, bless him, as well as being a good New Testament scholar, he reads murder mysteries as well. So they were talking 19 to the dozen at the far end of the table about murder mysteries and what it is that they like and which authors they were reading. And that got me thinking about this passion for justice. I don't myself much like murder mysteries because I don't like all the violence and the blood and all that. It just doesn't do it for me. But I do know that one of the reasons those books sell so well is that passion for justice. We read the newspapers and we see wicked people getting away with it, or we see wicked countries doing things that the rest of us seem powerless to stop, or we see gross injustice on a local or national or an international level. And yet, anyone, if you ask them, do you believe in justice? Pretty much anyone except the most hardened criminal will say, yes, of course, justice matters. That's what we have to do. And then we discover that this person is in fact fiddling their tax return, and that person has cheated in some business deal, or this country has flagrantly invaded another country, even though that is totally against international law and so on. In other words, we all know that justice matters, but we all mess it up. And yet we all retain this longing for justice, which is what makes some people read murder mysteries and other people say, I have to get voted onto the local council and then I will help sort it out. And at least half the people who've gone into local or national politics do so with that good motivation. What happens to them thereafter? Well, that's another story, part of the problem perhaps. So then, having set up the problem, I then do a reading of John in relation to it, which we'll come back to. But then, of course, love. We all know that relationships matter, as I said, and yet we all know, whether it's school time friends, where, you know, those of us who've had children know perfectly well that there is going to come a time when this daughter or that son is going to come home in tears because my best friend isn't friends with me anymore. Oh dear, what's gone wrong? How can we help? Maybe a phone call to the parents or whatever it is. We all know that friendships and love and companionship matter, but we can foul it up pretty badly, even when we're not really trying to. Sometimes we get mad and we do try to, but then particularly, of course, within marriage and families, sometimes things can go horribly wrong and often do. And yet the call of love is so often seen, and I would say quite rightly, as something to do with the call of God. First John says, those who live in love live in God and God lives in them. And some theologians have perhaps riskily explored the fact that within the Trinity, there is this sense of relationship, the inner relationship of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that theologians have explored the way in which we are invited to join that glorious dance, the perichoresis of the Trinity, and yet there too, we all mess it up, which is why in my tradition, as part of morning prayer and evening prayer, we have the confession of sins, and as why obviously within the Lord's Prayer, every day, every time we say it, we say, forgive us our trespasses. And the trespass isn't just that we've broken some stupid law, it's that we want to be in relationship with our Heavenly Father, and we've let him down again. And we come back again like the prodigal son crawling back with the smell of the pigsty still on him. And we say, Father, I'm sorry, I've done it again. And we wait for the Father to come and say, bring the best robe and the ring and all the rest of it. And we We know that relationships matter at every level, and we still mess them up. And then we go to John's Gospel, and of course, that's where it is. And particularly poignantly at the end, with Peter having denied Jesus, then astonishingly being reconciled. We'll come back to that. Spirituality, again, as I said, I think most people in most cultures to this day know that there is a dimension of human life for which we broadly use the word spirituality. When I was younger, that wasn't a word, wasn't a thing. People didn't talk about it. They maybe talked about religion or saying your prayers, but I vividly remember the first time I heard a friend talk about different pathways of Christian spirituality or something like that. And I knew when I heard that, this is an interesting way of talking about something that clearly matters, because I had been somebody who was nurtured in a prayerful home and church from my early days, and I'd sort of taken it for granted. But it's only when you look with other people's eyes from outside that, yes, there is something there, and this word spirituality names it, a level of human existence and experience that is more than just what you can touch and see, and more even than the best human relationships. There is something going on, something which has a sort of hidden music about it, because the beauty of music will be part of this, but goes beyond that again. And yet, there is this thing called the dark night of the soul, which comes upon some Christians, some people, for no apparent reason. And sometimes people say, oh, it's because you've turned away from God that he's turned away from you. But as I argued in my other recent book on the pandemic, that's all very well. That may be true sometimes, that things go dark and blank because we have sinned and turned away from God. But if you read the Psalms and if you read the book of Job, you'll find that very often in Scripture, it isn't like that at all. Something else is going on. And that easy relationship, which we sometimes have with the one we call Abba, Father, simply goes cold. And then when we read John's Gospel, we see similar things at certain points happening there. And then beauty. And I'm just going to read you, because I don't think I can better it off the top of my head, the beginning of the chapter on beauty, because I was writing this book in February last year, so like, I suppose, 18, 19 months ago. And I was alone in the house because my wife was visiting relatives elsewhere. And I was getting up early in the morning and working on this after I'd said my prayers. And at one point, I thought I need to go out and inhale the morning air. And it was still dark. It was early morning in February. It was quite cold. And this is what I saw. The moon has only a few days left in its cycle, rising now in the southeast about 2 hours before dawn. I stood outside this morning in the frosty air under a totally clear sky, marveling one more time at the infinite number of twinkling lights above me, small messages sent out so long ago that it makes the events in John's Gospel seem like yesterday. There was the moon, low and dramatic in its late crescent. To its left was the planet Venus, bright as the light of a landing plane. There to its right was Jupiter, not so bright, but with its own glowing beauty. I had to come indoors, but I returned several more times, and as the sun came up, 3 or 4 flocks of geese rose with it, honking and flapping on their morning journey, flying right past the bright crescent and the still visible planets. And then in the next paragraph I say, it is cloudy now. The geese have gone, and so has the glory of the night. I am enriched and also saddened. And that's the point about beauty, isn't it? The music stops. We have a memory of it, but we can't hear that great final resolution every time. We can't sense that vibrancy. The beauty becomes a memory, and it has changed us, but we want it again. C.S. Lewis, in his book Surprised by Joy, talks about that as the stab of joy. And we want it again, but what we really want is the stab, is the joy, to be surprised by joy again. And interestingly, of course, Lewis made that his journey. That's his equivalent of this book, really. Because then when he became a Christian, he found joy in all sorts of places, but it was now joy as a byproduct of what he was learning. So we have justice, love, spirituality, beauty, and then after the next bit of Johannine material, I move on to, where are we now? To freedom. And of course, you in America, you live on freedom, you believe in freedom. You have a Statue of Liberty, which one of the first things I ever saw in America. I sailed to New York in February 1968. Sailed across from Liverpool. I was going to spend 6 months in North America before going back to start as an undergrad in Oxford. And there was the Statue of Liberty, and I photographed it as we got closer and closer to it on the boat. And I remember thinking, wow, this is the land of the free. Well, yes, but, and you will know, and I know, and we all know, that freedom is more elusive than we imagine. It's certainly elusive politically, that there are many people in North America who don't feel free, and many people in other parts of the world who don't feel free because they feel Uncle Sam breathing down their necks, rightly or wrongly. That's a perception. But likewise, this happens within our personal lives, because freedom is kind of odd. Does it mean that I'm a random being who just bounces around like a subatomic particle, so that I don't have any causation in my life, that I just act without any motivations at all? Of course not. None of us feel like that. We feel that we are making actual choices. And when I choose to pick this book off the shelf, it means that I can't simultaneously pull that book off the shelf. So I'm making choices. And if the determinist comes along and says, that's because your brain is hardwired to do that, and your freedom is just actually an illusion, then I want to say, no, sorry, I have the freedom to pick that one or that one. And that philosophical debate can go on and has done. But what is genuine freedom? Is it just feeling easy in your harness, as one poet said, or is it a different sort of thing where I'm enabled to become the person that I was truly meant to be? Meant to be, who says? And how do you know? Well, there's the problem, the puzzle. So that's the puzzle of freedom. And of course, in John, we find Jesus saying glorious things like, if the Son makes you free, you will be really free. And that gets him a hot reaction from his listeners. But then moving rapidly on, truth. Well, as we all know now, truth is at stake in the modern and the postmodern world. But we have this problem, as Bernard Williams, the great philosopher, said in his last book, Truth and Truthfulness. We in today's world want more and more truth because we want to know what happened last week, which has caused this lawsuit, or we want to know what happened when some diplomat said something on the telephone which has caused a fuss in another country. But the way we get at that is by trying to have more and more evidence to fill filing cabinets with the record of who signed this piece of paper, who did that. And as we reach out for truth, it seems to elude our grasp, because everybody's truth is somebody's truth, isn't it? Well, that's what some people have said, that you only say that because it's serving your interests. Well, wait a minute. Does that mean I'm not telling you objective truth? No, of course not, because you're just a subject. So, etc., etc. And whether it's in personal relations, international relations, or with the media and the press, these arguments go back and back. And if, as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then we have a storm of protest coming back at us. How can you say that Jesus is the truth? What about all the other great teachers? And so on and so forth. So the longing for truth is a signpost which we all humans know it's pointing in the right direction, but it too is broken. And then power. Well, power for some people is just a dirty word these days. Lord Acton famously said 150 years ago, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, we can no doubt all fill in the blanks with political leaders and societal leaders, tragically maybe church leaders, who exemplify that problem. But the problem of power is that you can't do without it. As we've learned by watching what happened in Iraq after we toppled Saddam Hussein, tyranny may be awful, but anarchy is, if anything, even worse. So we need power. People need to be in control of society, because if they're not, the bullies and the bad guys and the unscrupulous always win. But if by giving somebody power, whether it's just as the treasurer of the golf club or the prime minister or president of some country, if you give them then a standing temptation to abuse that power, which has happened again and again and again, does that mean that power is, after all, a dirty word, or was there really something going on there? And it's a short step from there to talking about the kingdom of God, which is, of course, where we come into with the Gospels. So there are the 7 signposts. That's why I've done with them what I've done. And in the second half, I want to talk a bit, dangerously perhaps, about the way in which John's Gospel picks up those themes and helps us to move them forwards and hear them not just as signposts, but as vocations.